Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope all is well. I know it's a little crazy out there with snowstorms and uprisings. Today, we are going to be discussing the rules-based liberal order. So let's do this. For decades, we've been sold the so-called rules-based liberal order as the natural endpoint of human political evolution, that we've reached the end of history. They tell us that it emerged rationally. We're told it is morally superior, that this so-called liberal order is necessary to prevent chaos, war, and barbarism. But what if that narrative that we were sold is wrong? What if this order wasn't built out of calm reason, but rather from a collective trauma? What if the people who designed the post-war system weren't neutral architects, but rather psychologically scarred survivors of industrial slaughter, desperately trying to ensure history would never repeat itself? And what if, in doing so, they overcorrected so severely that they created a system so rigid, centralized, and ultimately authoritarian that now governs the world long after the original trauma has faded? The world wars weren't normal wars, historically. They were mechanized, industrial, all-encompassing upon society, with insane death tolls of not only soldiers but civilian populations. They didn't emerge in a vacuum, though. By the time Europe reached 1914, it had already destabilized for more than a century by ideological upheaval, causing uprisings, revolutions, and counter-revolutions that repeatedly tore apart the social order. The French Revolution unleashed the modern age of ideology, perpetuating the idea that society and even man could be redesigned according to abstract principles created by insane philosophers. That experiment collapsed into terror, mass executions, and eventually empire under Napoleon, whose wars bled the continent dry. In response, European elites desperately tried to freeze history. They restored monarchies, suppressed nationalism, and attempted to contain political movements through repression rather than reform. In response, European elites desperately tried to freeze history. They restored monarchies, suppressed nationalism, and attempted to contain political movements through repression rather than reform. That pressure didn't disappear, it accumulated. They didn't stomp out dangerous and societal destructive ideologies either, they only inflamed them. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe was a brittle system held together by threads with alliances of monarchies desperately trying to hold on to their empires, with nationalism, socialism, and class grievances simmering beneath the surface. World War I was not just a war, it was the release of all that pressure. For the first time, war became industrialized slaughter. Men were fed into trench systems, artillery barrages, chemical weapons, and nearly nonstop shelling and gunfire. Hundreds of thousands would die for territory measured in mere yards. The psychological damage of the sheer carnage, the madness, the macabre machine of senseless, brutal, horrid death is unimaginable. By 1918, the old world order officially died. The aftermath made everything worse, though. Empires collapsed, borders were redrawn arbitrarily, Germany was humiliated and disabled, Russia fell into revolution and became a brutal machine of industrialized violence, and the interwar period only saw the further radicalization of societies, not less. So when World War II erupted, it was not the experience of a single catastrophe. It was the confirmation that civilization itself was failing over and over again. This new war erased all limits there had been before. It targeted civilians deliberately, normalizing mass bombings of cities. It produced extermination campaigns, forced migrations, and population-level mass trauma. European Jewish communities lost 6 million plus, with centuries-old communities completely wiped out. The targeted policy of extermination aimed at them specifically caused extreme generational trauma that is still felt by them today. The Russians lost 27 million people in total in just the war, the aftermath of it all leaving them in a permanent siege mentality. permanent distrust, and this brutal ideology that everything, including nature itself, must be industrialized. China endured invasion, mass civilian slaughter, famine, displacement layered on top of civil war, resulting in a communist takeover and an isolationist mentality. By 1945, the nations were not just physically destroyed, they were morally disoriented, and everything that once was sensible and logical became adrift. They were exhausted, terrified of the capacity of violence that humanity could wrought, and understanding all of this is crucial, because the people who designed the post-war order believed human beings could not be trusted anymore, not nations, not cultures, not traditions, or ideologies, only systems, and only the systems they create. And out of this trauma came the belief that sovereignty was dangerous, national identity was deadly, tradition was fascist, and power must be restrained. So instead of reforming political culture organically, they outsourced all morality and decision-making to institutions. And this is when the international overlord institutions emerge, not as neutral tools for rational governance, but as safeguards against another civilizational upending, horrifying disaster from occurring. So what exactly is this rules-based liberal order? Early roots. Influenced by Enlightenment ideas such as the rule of law, individual rights, and limits on power, early precedents were Westphalia, which established the sovereignty of states, and 19th century international law and diplomacy norms. Hey guys, so it's that time where I need to ask you to subscribe to the channel, and if you're already subscribed, just hit the like, please. If you don't do this, I will be abducted by aliens. Thanks! The modern liberal order was explicitly built after World War II to prevent another global catastrophe, and its major goals were to avoid great power war, to stabilize economies, to promote democracy and free trade, and contain authoritarian expansion. They said we would have sovereign states, but with rules. They said countries were sovereign, but constrained by international laws. Borders would not be allowed to be changed by force. Any aggression is supposed to be delegitimized. Institutions were put in place, such as the United Nations for global security and diplomacy, the International Monetary Fund for financial stability, the World Bank for development and reconstruction, the World Trade Organization for trade rules, NATO for collective defense, and the International Court for state-to-state disputes, even the World Health Organization for health. Yes, tons and tons of bureaucracy to deal with all the problems that exist in the world. It's supposed to support and promote human rights, democracy, and things like freedom of speech, press, religion, and civil rights. It guarantees collective security because an attack on one is an attack on all. The United States is the primary architect of all this, writing many of the rules and acting as a security guarantor, using their military might and economic power to enforce the norms they choose. They enforce all this by economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation to countries that don't follow exactly as they say, trade penalties and military interventionism, coercion with aid and funding through loans. Let's look at a video that explains what happens when countries don't fall in line with the rules-based liberal order.
Well, the question is, what rules-based order are you talking about, right?
The rules-based order.
Well, I don't think there's only one, and that's part of the reason why we have a conflict going on right now over Ukraine and elsewhere. During the aftermath of World War II, the victorious powers put in place the foundations of the world order, the UN Charter, Bretton Woods Accords that governed the economic discourse in the world. The Russians opted out of the economic order, but they were participants in the UN system And on top of that, we reached understandings on rules of the game in Europe through the Helsinki Accords, which had a set of principles that everybody bought into. And the Russians, for the most part, have said, we're comfortable with that order. What we're not comfortable with is the post-Cold War order that emerged after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where the United States became the rule setter, the world's sole arbiter of how you apply rules, the decider on when it could exempt itself from those rules. And the Russians have said, wait a minute, we're not comfortable with that. We're not comfortable with a system in which the United States can decide when the rules don't apply to itself. The Russian position on this is, well, that's not a rules-based order. There are large parts of the world that say, yeah, we agree. We want something in which we have more of a voice. It looks a lot more like the post-World War II system than the post-Cold War system that evolved. So those are things that we're going to have to address. The only way to address them, I think, is diplomatically, if you're not going to actually go to war. Ultimately, the world's leading powers are going to all have to buy in to the contours of the world order. If they don't buy in, then you don't have an order.
When countries don't fall in line with the rules-based liberal order, so-called, we get constant interventions or they get economic sanctions. If that doesn't work, then they will go in and they'll cause popular uprisings that we've seen throughout the world. And we have the interventions in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe in the 90s. The major criticisms to all this are that the rules are always applied inconsistently. Allies often receive leniency, and states they consider enemies face strict punishments. The institutions always tend to favor Western countries, voting power tied to economic strength, and many countries have little to no influence. And of course, the U.S. intervenes militarily and even covertly with the CIA with any state they see fit, with no oversight, basically. The rising of multipolarity in the world is challenging this world order. The United States is no longer the dominant power in the world. There are now multiple and competing visions for the world. Nationalism movements and populist uprisings are focusing more and more on national sovereignty than liberal norms. More and more, the distrust of institutions is growing. Using financial systems as coercion and punishment is becoming increasingly unpopular on the world stage, and the dominance of the dollar is questioned more now than ever. Many scholars are arguing that the system has evolved into a rules-based order without a consensus, that it's rather focused on politics than fairness, and that dangerous ideologies such as globalism, technocracy, and Marxism have crept into these institutions. It is often asked, whose rules? Who enforces them? What happens when the rule makers break them? Now that we've learned a little bit about the rules-based liberal order, I did find a short little video that helps tie it all together.
From natural disasters to deadly diseases to wars, the world can be a turbulent, even chaotic place. But around 75 years ago, a new system was imagined to temper this turbulence and improve the lives of many. It is called the liberal world order. It is a liberal system in the sense that it operates on rules that are, in theory, applied to each country equally, and that it encourages each country to be democratic and to open its economy to the rest of the world. It is a global system in that every country around the world is encouraged to join and follow those rules, even if some do not. And it is a system that promotes order in that most countries that buy into it respect the borders of other countries and seek to resolve their differences peacefully. It was developed in an effort to avoid repeating the major man-made disasters of the first half of the 20th century, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars. Following World War II, the United States, along with several other countries, started drafting an aspirational blueprint for what later became known as the liberal world order by establishing certain international institutions. The United Nations was built to promote peace between countries. The World Bank would support global economic development, and the International Monetary Fund and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization, would support investment and trade between countries. While these institutions provided the blueprint for the liberal world order, the system was really powered by the United States. Its victory in World War II and booming post-war economy set an example for the rest of the world. The U.S. credited democracy and free markets for its success and urged other countries to become more democratic and to build economies that were open to trade and investment. Oftentimes, the U.S. would offer financial aid to other countries on the condition that they make such liberal reforms. At the same time, the United States military strength and global network of alliances helped maintain order. If any country tried to undermine the system or threatened to invade one of its allies, the U.S. was ready to apply economic pressure or stop them with military force. Though it wasn't the only one, the illiberal Soviet Union was the most powerful country to opt out of the liberal world order. While it was a member of the United Nations and other international institutions, it had no interest in becoming more liberal or democratic. Instead, the Soviet Union was focused on building its own order and promoting the adoption of its heavy-handed economic model, often by threatening or even using force against neighboring countries. The Cold War, which started in 1945 as World War II was ending, was a competition between the US-led liberal world order and the Soviet-led illiberal order. The two leading countries used their economic, political, and military power to expand and defend their respective orders for over 40 years. And while they never fought each other directly, they did fight each other indirectly through allies and proxies. In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the order it had controlled also disappeared, and the countries within it began to join the US-led liberal world order instead, making it more robust than ever. Many countries in Eastern Europe that had been in the Soviet sphere of influence joined NATO, the European Union, or both, as did many independent countries that emerged from what had been the Soviet Union. While there were still conflicts between and within countries, notably in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, by the end of the 1990s, this system had produced a world that was more peaceful, more democratic, more prosperous, and healthier than ever before. The world economy had grown more than 6 times larger in size, and people were living more than 20 years longer on average than they had been back in 1945. But since the late 2000s, the liberal world order has become weaker and is facing challenges on every front. The liberal world order is now less liberal. Some countries are less democratic at home and less inclined to support human rights and the rule of law elsewhere. The liberal world order is now less orderly. Some countries are ignoring the territorial integrity of others, like when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea. Also, international institutions are struggling to address major problems that require collective action, like the spread of nuclear weapons and global pandemics, or stemming conflict and violence within countries. And combating new sources of disorder, from cyber attacks to climate change, will require new rules and international coordination, which do not yet exist. The liberal world order is now less global. Powers like China are trying to build their own regional orders through military and security coordination and by offering loans and investments in infrastructure, enabling them to exert greater influence on their neighbors' economic and political decisions. Historically, the United States has been the principal leader and greatest supporter of the liberal world order, but that commitment has weakened. In recent years, the American people have become less supportive of using the country's military on behalf of policies they believe are too costly or do not involve vital national interests. And some leaders of countries allied to the United States have grown less confident that the U.S. would come to their defense if they come under attack. The beating heart of the liberal world order has slowed, and it is unlikely there is a country or group of countries that could take on the U.S.'s role and responsibilities. China is powerful, but uninterested in supporting liberalism or democracy. And even if it was, its authoritarian model is unattractive to much of the world. European countries might be interested in working together to support it, but they have their own challenges and lack sufficient power. So that leaves the U.S. as the best contender to lead a renewal of the liberal world order by encouraging international coordination. If the U.S. fails to address the challenges facing the liberal world order, it will continue to weaken, and the world will likely become less prosperous, less peaceful, and less democratic once again.
I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was a little informational, but the rules-based order isn't exactly how it was. Things don't seem like they're promoting democracy, and actually it feels an awful lot like authoritarianism. So it makes people ask, is it liberal? One thinker on the topic is a man named Paul Gottfried, and he argues that the post-war governance did not produce liberalism in the classical sense. He claims it produced managerial liberalism, a system where bureaucracies replace organic authority, moral consensus is enforced administratively, dissent is treated as a pathology, and history for them is frozen at 1945. In his work, Gottfried makes the case that the post-war elite class internalized the war as a moral lesson that could never be questioned. So this is a summary of the book written by Paul Gottfried and Joseph R. Stromberg, After Liberalism, Mass Democracy in the Managerial State. Liberalism and democracy are now conflated. Americans have given up freedom and self-government for a mess of pottage. Modern liberalism, argues political science professor Paul Gottfried in his insightful new book, rests on a patricide of the older liberalism. Whereas liberalism and democracy were once opposed concepts, they are now conflated, to the great detriment of the former. Meanwhile, democracy, which replaced liberal republicanism, gave way to irresponsible centralized bureaucracies. Thus, liberal democracy is less and less liberal or democratic by any standards. The liberals' managerial state succeeds by denying that it exercises power, Gottfried writes. Liberals aspire to run the economy and socialize children away from their parents' outworn values. They now wish to do so worldwide as an outreach program of American imperialism. They are building a new society that they, at least, expect to like better than the imperfect one they see around them. And we're going to pause that right there, and I'm going to play a video for you, because a lot of people talk about the New World Order, or a lot of people talk about fascism. And a lot of times the people on the left, what we call liberals nowadays, they like to say that certain things are fascist or certain people are fascist. But there is a saying, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. And what he's saying is that it's less democratic and less liberal. So what is it? Is it authoritarianism? Is it fascism? One of the pillars of fascism, because it is a complicated subject, not just one thing, black and white, but one of the pillars of it, one of the core principles, was the combination of the corporate and the government ruling together. Like the government would rule with the corporations attached to them. So you could have private corporations, but they were controlled by the state.
What do you say to those families who say, listen, we can't afford to pay $4.85 a gallon for months, if not years. This is just not sustainable.
Well, what you heard from the president today was a clear articulation of the stakes. This is about the future of the liberal world order, and we have to stand firm.
The liberal world order? That doesn't sound good. Joining me now, someone who I'm sure can explain this to all of us, my friend James Lindsay. He is, frankly, the best guy I know explaining communism, what these people want, why they want it. He's the founder of newdiscourses.com, which I would recommend, and author of the book you should read if you want to understand them, Race Marxism. Go get this book if you want to understand what they're doing here. James, what in the world is the liberal world order? That sounds really creepy.
Yeah, I think it probably is really creepy. I think it's a fraud. I think it's a brand name for what might better be called the neoliberal world order. Some people would have called that just a new world order. It's a public-private partnership between government entities and big business and actually other kind of big players, foundations.
Oh, oh, that's interesting. That sounds like fascism, or at least a principle of fascism. How interesting.
Faith leaders, etc., to try to coordinate how we're going to live, how we're going to buy, how we're going to sell, what we can buy and what we can sell, where we can travel, when we can't travel. It is the overarching system that has been a parasite on the true liberal system that we.
Wow. I mean, yeah, the globalists do tell us that we'll own nothing and be happy, and that we'll eat the bugs, like the guy that started the World Economic Forum likes to say. How interesting. These are the ones that the Democrats all support. These are the policies that the Democrats push, right? Seems really authoritarian, doesn't it?
The thought that we had that's enshrined in our Constitution. If you would know, of course, because you're a gentleman and a scholar, but that the liberalism, broadly speaking, is not what these people are doing. Liberalism is not a public-private partnership between business and government. It is a kind of philosophical position that nobody deserves political authority. So with the consent of the government, we'll lend it to some people for a short amount of time and then vote them out of office if we don't like.
So what he's speaking about is actually called classical liberalism, which is not in practice anywhere in the world anymore and hasn't been for quite some time. And I do go over that in one of my long form videos. I'm not for sure which one, but we do go over what classical liberalism is and what neoliberalism is, which is what we have now.
Like them. What this is something completely different. It's a way for government and big business to come in through the back door to control everything that they want to control, which is everything and us.
James, I have kind of a dark question, but it's on my mind as I hear you explain this private government partnership, the business government partnership out there. That seems so overwhelming for me, for the average citizen. Okay, well, if Nike is going to join with the U.S. government against me, what chance do I have? It seems like all the powerful entities are joining against us, and we seem so small. Is that an odd way to put it?
I mean, it is. It's a correct way to put it. We are very small against this machine, but the problem is that the machine doesn't work without us. They can have all the public and private partnership that they want, but and Nike can be involved, and ExxonMobil can be involved, and all of the big corporations can be involved. But they're also getting squeezed, and they can't produce unless everybody's producing around them. They think that machines will do all the production, but obviously, they're not doing the best with making systems that actually work in those regards. And so we are small, but we actually have a lot on our side. We also, supposing that we, could get, one or two Republicans in the universe that have a spine, we also have the Constitution on our side if somebody will stand up and defend it legally. big business and government are not supposed to be able to collude this way. So the courts can actually really strike this down. Our legislators can take some pretty bold action, like banning the data mining that they need to make it work. And our corporate leaders can actually realize that they're going to get the screw on this as well, and can speak up and start blowing the whistle into the fact that this is, in a sense, a gigantic criminal conspiracy that's been going on for a long time. And once that starts coming out, the system that we put in place that actually removes power from small numbers of hands can start to rumble into action and defend you and me, us little guys.
Back to the article. Modern liberals from J.S. Mill through Herbert Croly, Walter Whale, Walter Lippmann, and John Dewey and his followers justified the all-embracing state. John Dewey's the guy who created the library system and a bunch of other weird stuff that has to do with education. Those social democrats stole their name from laissez-faire liberals, but talked a good game of democracy. As far back as Mill, they foresaw their ability as a new clerisy to guide democracy along desired paths. They were called progressives. They tried one name out for a little while. I can't remember what it was. And then they just decided to call themselves Democrats, I think. Godfrey argues that liberalism has become an armed doctrine, since letting people go their own way will not suffice to make them open-minded or civic-spirited. Only constant intervention by trained administrators with a universal faith of rationality could avert the horrors attendant on actually leaving anyone anywhere alone. Fascist and Bolshevik social reconstruction fascinated the liberals. They settled for John Dewey's experimental scientific approach, allegedly open-ended and rooted in neutral works, generally known when an experiment is over. In the new state, it is the lab rats who are blamed for bad outcomes if failure is even admitted. The order to ride the mass transit system of progress and quit reading the pre-scientific Constitution. By the 1940s, liberals defined their outlook as a fighting faith opposed to fascism, communism having somewhat escaped their attention. Value relativity had been a useful cudgel against existing elite Christian values, social acids, as one Deweyite put it. But liberalism itself was exempt from inquisition. Ongoing experiment gave ever-shifting content to an ever-new liberalism. The welfare state was means and end, since planning and economic redistribution were keys to a rational society. Freedom, Godfrey observes, was reduced to what judges, public administrators, and journalists see fit to impose on other people. Bored with handing out pottage, welfare states also tried to shape or reshape social relations to fit particular worldviews. This social engineering and therapy is known oddly as pluralism, although it is plural only in terms of organized factions, accredited victims, and the administrators themselves. Godfrey quarrels with paleoconservatives who see modern liberalism as a front for new class public meddlers. The truth, he says, is much worse. The administrations actually believe in their ideology and wish to impose it everywhere. Fearing after 1945 that fascism might come back, liberals turned education into an engine of social reconstruction. Egged on by the Marxist charlatan Theodore Adorno, they fretted over the backward Americans' mental health and psychoanalyzed the radical right. In the hands of journalists incapable of making distinctions, this attitude became a weapon of mass demonization. Multiculturalism serves as another weapon in the liberal arsenal of weaponry. The present regime assigns ethnicity and other generic categories to rearrangeable groups of citizens as an exercise of power. Godfrey writes, from the manager's standpoint, the behavior modification of Americans/mankind must go on indefinitely. This is Bolshevism light, I guess. Stalin could never completely achieve a state composed of new Soviet men, and the modern liberals will never completely achieve a state of ideally servile, collectively minded citizens, but to give up would be the entire project at risk. Liberal managerial meddling has no logical stopping point. Godfrey surveys sundry American and European populist movements, concluding that little can be done to roll back or even slow the advancing Leviathan. Its pessimism aside, I strongly recommend this densely packed and reflective book, to which I have hardly done justice, which rests on Professor Godfrey's great erudition and close reading of relevant European and American literature. So the promise was simple. If we build enough rules, enough institutions, enough oversight mechanisms, war would become obsolete. But these assumptions actually ignore and try to rewrite human history and our own humanity. Look, I'm going to be real honest with you guys. If I can't get people to subscribe or like, YouTube will literally send aliens to my house. Do you want me to be probed? I need you to like and to subscribe. Thank you. Conflict doesn't just disappear, it relocates. Now we have not only wars, but sanctions, economic warfare, informational warfare, lawfare, proxy conflicts, mass migration issues, all justified as defending the order. But as the nanny state tries to manage nations by erasing what we know to be true and logical, it only complicates our world more and more. Let's have a look at what people were saying at the World Economic Forum just recently. So this is a manager. This is one of the managers of our liberal world order. Let's see what he has to say. The Canadian Prime Minister, apparently.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international...
Oh, really? You knew that. Interesting.
law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
Okay, so they've been doing this kind of stuff for decades, like he said, like for decades we've had all these issues. They just don't like it because Donald Trump's doing it and he's trying to, like, as far as anyone can tell, fix all of this craziness. But who knows? Who knows? But here, because some people do say that, and we've talked about this before, I believe with the Jimmy Dore interview, we talk about this, and I did express some of my feelings on that, which dramatically change constantly because that's the world we live in nowadays. So I did find this video of this guy, and it's not very long, and I don't even know who he is, talking about the Trump angle of this whole thing. So let's see what he has to say.
Today, the geography of the New World Order that Trump and his supporters are determined to build is becoming increasingly clear. This time, Trump 2.0 is firmly resolved to break away from both left liberal globalism and the neocons, who are in essence just another form of globalists, and refuses to compromise with their projects. He is severing ties with the past and setting the U.S. aircraft carrier on a new course. The model of international relations that Trump adheres to can be described as the order of great powers. This is a logical extension of the entire MAGA ideology.
Okay, so he just said the orders of great power. So let's see what that is just really quick. Okay, so ah, Okay, so a great power is a sovereign state that is recognized as having the ability and the expertise to exert its influence on a global scale. Great powers characteristically possess military and economic strength as well as diplomatic and soft power influence, which may cause middle or small powers to consider the great power's opinions before taking actions of their own. International relations theorists have posited that great power status can be characterized into power capabilities, spatial aspects, and status dimensions. Okay, that might be something we look into a little more, but I just thought we would educate ourselves a little bit on that.
Make America great again. The very name underscores that it is not about the West, not about spreading liberal democracy worldwide, and not about Atlanticism, but specifically about the United States as a nation-state. According to Trump's vision, this state must completely free itself from globalism, along with the constraints, obligations, and imperatives associated with it. In Trump's eyes, almost all existing international institutions reflect the old order, whereas he seeks to create a new one. This applies to everything: the UN, NATO, WTO, WHO, and all other supranational bodies. He sees all of them as the creations of liberals and globalists, whereas he himself firmly and consistently stands on the principles of realism. Trump thinks in terms of his own civilizational state, Greater America. At the same time, he is in no hurry, nor does he intend to abandon hegemony, at least on a regional level, but he is changing the subject of this hegemony. It is no longer a liberal world order based on ever-changing rules and the usurpation of power by international cosmopolitan elites in the spirit of George Soros's global open society project, as envisioned by the deep state which Trump has dismantled. Rather, it is the leadership of the United States as a great power among other great powers which possess real, not nominal, sovereignty and capable of competing with the U.S. in one way or another. Thus, instead of the bipolar Cold War world, instead of the unipolar neoconservative world, or the non-polar world of liberal globalists, Trumpism envisions a 3- or 4-polar world, with a balance of power defining the architecture of the future world order. This will require the re-establishment of nearly all international institutions so that they reflect actual realities rather than being phantom remnants of past eras, no longer anchored in concrete reality.
I found that interesting. Okay, so here's the core of the problem, in my opinion. The rules-based order is trauma-locked. It's frozen in moral assumptions and ideas that are based on what's called the blank slate fallacy. And this assumption, this belief that they can treat humans as blank slates, that cultural and ethnicity doesn't matter, and you can just plug and play democracy. That if we do away with traditions and nationalism, then we can prevent a Hitler from ever occurring again. They have this idea that they can design the correct system that will socially engineer new people, better people. Never heard of the blank slate fallacy? Well, let's learn about that. What is the blank slate fallacy? The blank slate fallacy refers to the belief that humans are born with no innate traits, predispositions, or mental structures, meaning all behavior, personality, and knowledge are shaped entirely by environment and experience. This idea is rooted in John Locke's 17th century philosophy of tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate. And it became a foundational concept in empiricism and later influenced behavioralism and social sciences. Now, I know that seems a little crazy to you, but that's what they actually believe, okay? However, modern cognitive science, neuroscience, and genetics have largely disproved the literal blank slate model. Research shows humans are born with innate capabilities, such as instinct for language, emotional responses, spatial awareness, and basic social cognition that shape how they interact with and learn from their environment. So there was this guy that 20 years ago wrote a book about this, and I have that available, a wiki about it. The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker. The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature is a best-selling 2002 book by cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker in which he argues against tabula rasa models in the social sciences, claiming that human behavior is significantly shaped by evolved psychological traits. The book was nominated for the 2003 Adventist Prizes and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Pinker argues that modern science has challenged three linked dogmas that constitute the dominant view of human nature in intellectual life. Blank slate, the idea that the mind has no innate traits. Empiricism, the noble savage. I'm sure you guys have heard of that before. These intellectuals that love to lord over us and pretend like they're better than us. They also have this notion called the noble savage, meaning that we're all a bunch of disgusting, horrible, useless degenerates, but that there was this time in the past where you had the savages that were noble and that we should aspire to be like them, which is Marxist because that's what he talked about too. Also, the ghost in the machine, the notion that each person has a soul making choices independent of biology. Much of this book is dedicated to examining fears of the social and political consequences of his new view on human nature, the fear of inequality, the fear of imperfectibility, the fear of determinism, and the fear of nihilism. Pinker claims these fears are non sequiturs and that the blank slate view of human nature would actually be a greater threat if it were true. For example, he argues that political equality does not require sameness, but policies that treat people as individuals with rights, that moral progress does not require the human mind to be naturally free of selfish motives, only that it has other motives to counteract them. The responsibility does not require behavior to be uncaused, only that it responds to praise and blame. The meaning in life does not require that the process that shaped the brain must have a purpose, only that the brain itself must have purposes. He also argues that grounding moral values in claims about a blank slate opens them to the possibility of being overturned by future empirical discoveries. He further argues that a blank slate is in fact inconsistent with opposition to many social evils, since a blank slate could be conditioned to enjoy servitude and degradation. Now, I found this guy's TED Talk, and since it wasn't very long, I thought we would watch it.
A year ago, I spoke to you about a book that I was just in the process of completing that has come out in the interim, and I'd like to talk to you today about some of the controversies that book inspired. The book is called The Blank Slate, based on the popular idea that the human mind is a blank slate and that all of its structure comes from socialization, culture, parenting, experience. The blank slate was an influential idea in the 20th century. Here are a few quotes indicating that man has no nature, from the historian Jose Ortega y Gasset. Man has no instincts, from the anthropologist Ashley Montague. The human brain is capable of a full range of behaviors and predisposed to none, from the late scientist Stephen Jay Gould. There are a number of reasons to doubt that the human mind is a blank slate. And some of them just come from common sense. As many people have told me over the years, anyone who's had more than one child knows that kids come into the world with certain temperaments and talents. It doesn't all come from the outside. Oh, and anyone who has both a child and a house pet has surely noticed that the child exposed to speech will acquire a human language, whereas the house pet won't, presumably because of some innate difference between them. And anyone who's ever been in a heterosexual relationship knows that the minds of men and the minds of women are not indistinguishable. There are also, I think, increasing results from the scientific study of humans that indeed were not born blank slates. One of them from anthropology is the study of human universals. If you've ever taken anthropology, you know that it's a kind of an occupational pleasure of anthropologists to show how exotic other cultures can be, and that there are places out there where supposedly everything is the opposite to the way it is here. But if you instead look at what is common to the world's cultures, you find that there is an enormously rich set of behaviors and emotions and ways of construing the world that can be found in all of the world's 6,000 odd cultures. The anthropologist Donald Brown has tried to list them all, and they range from aesthetics, affection, and age statuses, all the way down to weaning, weapons, weather, attempts to control the color white, and a worldview. Also, genetics and neuroscience are increasingly showing that the brain is intricately structured. This is a recent study by the neurobiologist Paul Thompson and his colleagues, in which they, using MRI, measured the distribution of gray matter, that is the outer layer of the cortex, in a large sample of pairs of people. And they coded correlations in the thickness of gray matter in different parts of the brain using a false color scheme in which no difference is coded as purple, and any color other than purple indicates a statistically significant correlation. Well, this is what happens when you pair people up at random. By definition, the two people picked at random can't have correlations in the distribution of gray matter in the cortex. This is what happens in people who share half of their DNA, fraternal twins. And as you can see, large amounts of the brain are not purple, showing that if one person has a thicker bit of cortex in that region, so does his fraternal twin. And here's what happens if you get a pair of people who share all of their DNA, namely clones or identical twins. And you can see huge areas of cortex where there are massive correlations in the distribution of gray matter. Now, these aren't just differences in anatomy, like the shape of your earlobes, but they have consequences in thought and behavior that are well illustrated in this famous cartoon by Charles Addams. Separated at birth, the Malafert twins meet accidentally. And as you can see, there are two inventors with identical contraptions in their lap meeting in the waiting room of a patent attorney. Now, the cartoon is not such an exaggeration, because studies of identical twins who were separated at birth and then tested in adulthood show that they have astonishing similarities. And this happens in every pair of identical twins separated at birth ever studied, much less so with fraternal twins separated at birth. My favorite example is of a pair of twins, one of whom was brought up as a Catholic in a Nazi family in Germany. The other was brought up in a Jewish family in Trinidad. When they walked into the lab in Minnesota, they were wearing identical navy blue shirts with epaulettes. Both of them liked to dip buttered toast in coffee. Both of them kept rubber bands around their wrists. Both of them flushed the toilet before using it as well as after. And both of them liked to surprise people by sneezing in crowded elevators to watch them jump. Now, the story might seem too good to be true, but when you administer batteries of psychological tests, you get the same results, namely identical twins separated at birth show quite astonishing similarities. Now, given both that common sense and scientific data are calling the doctrine of the blank slate into question, why should it have been such an appealing notion? Well, there are a number of political reasons why people have found it congenial. The foremost is that if we're blank slates, then by definition we are equal, because 0 equals 0 equals 0. But if something is written on the slate, then some people could have more of it than others, and according to this line of thinking, that would justify discrimination and inequality.
So that right there explains to you why politically our managerial elites that are running this rules-based liberal order like the theory of the blank slate so much, because they want to plug and play. They want to bring in mass immigration into countries, and they expect, because of the blank slate theory, that everyone will just assimilate and become exactly like everyone else because we have the education system, and it might be rough at first, but eventually they will all be relatively fine, all the same. And if we train them up in the systems that we've created and we put into them what we want the world to be like, that then everybody will just be like that because of the blank slate. And that's literally what they think. That's why they're doing all these things that doesn't make any sense to any of us. And we're like, this isn't working. And it isn't working. Clearly, it's not. But they can never go back on it because they can never admit that they're wrong. Because also, what goes along with people ruling over you, or the elite mindset, is that they always know better. And so they will continue to do these crazy, outlandish things because they cannot self reflect on what's going on and see any other way. But this is why they like the blank slate theory, which is actually a logical fallacy.
Another political fear of human nature is that if we were blank slates, we can perfect mankind, the age-old dream of the perfectibility of our species, through social engineering, whereas if we're born with certain instincts, then perhaps some of them might condemn us to selfishness, prejudice, and violence. Well, in the book, I argue that these are, in fact, non sequiturs. And just to make a long story short, first of all, the concept of fairness is not the same as the concept of sameness. And so when Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," he did not mean we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are clones. Rather, that all men are equal in terms of their rights, and that every person ought to be treated as an individual and not prejudged by the statistics of particular groups that they may belong to. Also, even if we were born with certain ignoble motives, they don't automatically lead to ignoble behavior. And that is because the human mind is a complex system with many parts, and some of them can inhibit others. For example, there's excellent reason to believe that virtually all humans are born with a moral sense. And we have cognitive abilities that allow us to profit from the lessons of history. So even if people did have impulses towards selfishness or greed, that's not the only thing in the skull, and there are other parts of the mind that can counteract them. And in the book, I go over controversies such as this one and a number of other hot buttons, hot zones, Chernobyls, third rails, and so on, including the arts, cloning, crime, free will, education, evolution, gender differences, God, homosexuality, infanticide, inequality, Marxism, morality, Nazism, parenting, politics, race, religion, resource depletion, social engineering, technological risk, and war. And needless to say, there were certain risks in taking on these subjects. When I wrote a first draft of the book, I circulated it to a number of colleagues for comments, and here are some of the reactions that I got. Better get a security camera for your house. Don't expect to get any more awards, job offers, or positions in scholarly societies. Tell your publisher not to list your hometown in your author bio. Do you have tenure? Well, the book came out in October, and nothing terrible has happened. There was indeed reason to be nervous, and there were moments in which I did feel nervous, knowing the history of what has happened to people who've taken controversial stands or discovered disquieting findings in the behavioral sciences. There are many cases, some of which I talk about in the book, of people who've been
Really, in any sciences or educational pursuits or political pursuits, if you go against the grain or you think logically about things and you say this isn't working, or you explain things that isn't approved, then you are ostracized and you are called terrible names. And that's just the way that it's gone, because for some reason our liberal overlords that make all these rules have decided that you're not allowed to have differing opinions without there being consequences. So once again we ask, is it liberal? Is it actually meant to fight authoritarianism?
Slandered, called Nazis, physically assaulted, threatened with criminal prosecution for stumbling across or arguing about controversial findings. And you never know when you're going to come across one of these booby traps. My favorite example is a pair of psychologists who did research on left-handers and published some data showing that left-handers are, on average, more susceptible to disease, more prone to accidents, and have a shorter lifespan. It's not clear, by the way, since then whether that is an accurate generalization, but the data at the time seemed to support that. Well, pretty soon they were barraged with enraged letters, death threats, ban on the topic in a number of scientific journals coming from irate left-handers and their advocates. And they were literally afraid to open their mail because of the venom and vituperation that they had inadvertently inspired. Well, I mean, the night is young, but so the book has been out for half a year, and nothing terrible has happened. None of the dire professional consequences has taken place. I haven't been exiled from the city of Cambridge. But what I wanted to talk about are two of these hot buttons that have aroused the strongest response in the 80-odd reviews that the blank slate has received. I'll just put that list up for a few seconds and see if you can guess which two topics. I would estimate that probably two of these topics inspired probably 90% of the reaction in the various reviews and radio interviews. It's not violence and war, it's not race, it's not gender, it's not Marxism, it's not Nazism. They are the arts and parenting. So let me tell you what aroused such irate responses, and I'll let you decide whether the claim.
Remember in my spycraft before the CIA where we go over ancient tactics, ancient spycraft tactics, and remember in that video, I believe, we talked about how subversion is really important for all of us to know, and that one of the first targets when you are subverting a population, a culture, a nation, is the arts. So they get into the arts first. Something to be very aware of.
Claims are really that outrageous. Well, let me start with the arts. I note that among the long list of human universals that I presented a few slides ago are art. There is no society ever discovered in the remotest corner of the world that has not had something that we would consider the arts. Visual arts, decoration of surfaces and bodies appears to be a human universal, telling of stories, music, dance, poetry found in all cultures, and many of the motifs and themes that give us pleasure in the arts can be found in all human societies. A preference for symmetrical forms, the use of repetition and variation, even things as specific as the fact that in poetry all over the world you have lines that are very close to 3 seconds long, separated by pauses. Now, on the other hand, in the second half of the 20th century, the arts are frequently said to be in decline. And I have a collection, probably 10 or 15 headlines from highbrow magazines deploring the fact that the arts are in decline in our time. I'll give you a couple of representative quotes. We can assert with some confidence that our own period is one of decline, that the standards of culture are lower than they were 50 years ago, and that the evidences of this decline are visible in every department of human activity. That's a quote from T.S. Eliot, a little more than 50 years ago. And a more recent one. The possibility of sustaining high culture in our time is becoming increasingly problematical. Serious bookstores are losing their franchise. Nonprofit theaters are surviving primarily by commercializing their repertory. Symphony orchestras are diluting their programs. Public television is increasing its dependence on reruns of British sitcoms. Classical radio stations are dwindling. Museums are resorting to blockbuster shows. Dance is dying. That's from Robert Brustein, the famous drama critic and director in The New Republic about 5 years ago. Well, in fact, the arts are not in decline. I don't think this would come as a surprise to anyone in this room, but by any standard, they have never been flourishing to a greater extent. There are, of course, entirely new art forms and new media, many of which you've heard over these few days. By any economic standard, the demand for art of all forms is skyrocketing, as you can tell from the price of opera tickets, by the number of books sold, by the number of books published, the number of musical titles released, the number of new albums, and so on. The only grain of truth to this complaint that the arts are in decline come from three spheres. One of them is in elite art since the 1930s, say the kinds of works performed by major symphony orchestras, where most of the repertory is before 1930, or the works shown in major galleries and prestigious museums. In literary criticism and analysis, probably 40 or 50 years ago, literary critics were kind of cultural hero. Now they're kind of a national joke. And in the humanities and arts programs in the universities, which by many measures indeed are in decline. Students are staying away in droves. Universities are disinvesting in the arts and humanities. Well, here's a diagnosis. They didn't ask me, but by their own admission, they need all the help that they can get. And I would like to suggest that it's not a coincidence that this supposed decline in the elite arts and criticism occurred in the same point in history in which there was a widespread denial of human nature. A famous quotation can be found, if you look on the web, you can find it in literally scores of English course syllabuses. In or about December 1910, human nature changed. A paraphrase of a quote by Virginia Woolf, and there's some debate as to what she actually meant by that, but it's very clear looking at these syllabuses that it's used now as a way of saying that all of the forms of appreciation of art that were in place for centuries or millennia in the 20th century were discarded.
Gee, how interesting. 1910. Fits in quite nicely with our topic here, don't you think?
That beauty and pleasure in art, probably a human universal, began to be considered saccharine or kitsch or commercial. Barnett Newman had a famous quote that the impulse of modern art is the desire to destroy beauty, which was considered bourgeois or tacky. Here's just one example. I mean, this is perhaps a representative example of visual depiction of the...
So the fact that they called it bourgeois, that is cultural Marxism. That is Marxism. Marxists didn't like the elite things of that. The elite had to change. The elite isn't the same as it used to be. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not the same. They used to be smarter and cultured and better at things, but they're not anymore because that had to be destroyed because of Marxism, which is a dangerous ideology of philosophers, and of a philosopher before that was really weird and into really weird stuff, who got his stuff from a weird occult way back in ancient time, which one day we will get into, as I have promised several times. But that's where they're getting this stuff from. They're getting it from weird philosophers. Even Locke, who is a liberal philosopher, so not Marxist, came up with this blank slate thing that they ran with. So this is why I say philosophy is extremely dangerous. You have to be very careful with it. You need to know where it's coming from and its origins are.
Female form in the 15th century. Here is a representative example of the depiction of the female form in the 20th century. And as you can see, something has changed in the way the elite arts appeal to the senses. Indeed, in movements of modernism and postmodernism, there was visual art without beauty, literature without narrative and plot, poetry without meter and rhyme, architecture and planning without ornament, human scale, green space, natural light, music without melody and rhythm, and criticism without clarity, attention to aesthetics, and insight into the human condition. Let me just give you an example to back up that last statement. But here, one of the most famous literary English scholars of our time is the Berkeley professor Judith Butler. Here is an example of one of her analyses. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects. Well, you get the idea. By the way, this is one sentence. You can actually parse it. Well, the argument in the blank slate was that elite art and criticism in the 20th century, although not the arts in general, have disdained beauty, pleasure, clarity, insight, and style. People are staying away from elite art and criticism. What a puzzle. I wonder why. Well, this turned out to be probably the most controversial claim in the book. Someone asked me whether I stuck it in order to deflect ire from discussions of gender and Nazism and race and so on. I won't comment on that. But it certainly inspired an energetic reaction from many university professors. Well, the other hot button is parenting. And the starting point is for that discussion was the fact that we have all been subject to the advice of the parenting industrial complex. Now here is a representative quote from a besieged mother. "I'm overwhelmed with parenting advice. I'm supposed to do lots of physical activity with my kids so I can instill in them a physical fitness habit so they'll grow up to be healthy adults. And I'm supposed to do all kinds of intellectual play so they'll grow up smart. And there are all kinds of play. Clay for finger dexterity, word games for reading success, large motor play, small motor play. I feel like I could devote my life to figuring out what to play with my kids." And I think anyone who's recently been a parent can sympathize with this mother. Well, here's some sobering facts about parenting. Most studies of parenting on which this advice is based are useless. They're useless because they don't control for heritability. They measure some correlation between what the parents do, how the children turn out, and assume a causal relation, that the parenting shaped the child. Parents who talk a lot to their kids have kids who grew up to be articulate. Parents who spank their kids have kids who grew up to be violent, and so on. And very few of them control for the possibility that parents pass on genes that increase the chances a child will be articulate or violent, and so on. Until the studies are redone with adoptive children who provide an environment but not genes to their kids, we have no way of knowing whether these conclusions are valid. The genetically controlled studies have some sobering results. Remember the Malafert twins, separated at birth, then they meet in the patent office, remarkably similar. Well, what would have happened if the Malafert twins had grown up together? You might think, well, then they'd be even more similar because not only would they share their genes, but they would also share their environment. That would make them super similar, right? Wrong. Identical twins, or any siblings who are separated at birth, are no less similar than if they had grown up together. Everything that happens to you in a given home over all of those years appears to leave no permanent stamp on your personality or intellect. A complementary finding from a completely different methodology is that adopted siblings reared together, the mirror image of identical twins reared apart, they share their parents, their home, their neighborhood, don't share their genes, end up not similar at all. Okay, two different bodies of research with a similar finding. What it suggests is that children are shaped not by their parents over the long run, but in part, only in part, by their genes, in part by their culture, the culture of the country at large, and the children's own culture, namely their peer group.
So this concept that he's talking about right now, which this was like 17 years ago or something like that, 20, I don't know, is extremely controversial nowadays, especially. And there is a lot of discussion about this as countries are having mass migration issues. That is brought up, that there are cultural differences that are actually genetic, that shape people and how they behave, and that it goes against the blank slate theory. So it's automatically bad. It's automatically like no one's allowed to bring this up. And if you do, you are called terrible names. But it is a huge topic of discussion nowadays, especially as censorship, as much as they don't like it, has been sort of eased up on. And so I have been hearing more about this topic, and it is actually kind of fascinating and very interesting. And so maybe we will look into that more, but I just wanted to say here at this point while he's discussing that this is extremely controversial, and anything controversial I find interesting.
As we heard from Jill Sobule earlier today, that's what kids care about. And to a very large extent, larger than most people are prepared to acknowledge, by chance. Chance events in the wiring of the brain in utero, chance events as you live your life. So let me conclude with just a remark to bring it back to the theme of choices. I think that the sciences of human nature, behavioral genetics, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, are going to increasingly, in the years to come, upset various dogmas, careers, and deeply held political belief systems. And that presents us with a choice. The choice is whether certain facts about humans or topics are to be considered taboos, forbidden knowledge, where we shouldn't go there because no good can come from it, or to explore them honestly. I have my own answer to that question, which comes from a great artist of the 19th century, Anton Chekhov, who said, "Man will become better when you show him what he is like." And I think that the argument can't be put any more eloquently than that. Thank you very much.
The ideas and beliefs that our elite ruling overlords hold is, in my idea, the reason our government no longer works for us. They really don't care what their populations think anymore, and while they think they are better than us and are doing what is best for the world, the truth is they really will not let us adapt or evolve in any way that they don't approve of. Any challenge to it is treated as not political disagreements, but rather as authoritarianism, extremism, regression, and moral failure. This makes reform impossible because that would require them to admit that they are wrong and that they are actually authoritarian and regressive. All these post-war institutions, well, once they were created, they seek to justify their own existence. They inevitably have and will expand mandates, redefine threats, create dependency, and centralize power. The order ultimately no longer exists to prevent a major war, but it exists to perpetuate itself and shape the world in its own image. The tragedy is not that the post-war order was created. The tragedy is that it was never allowed to evolve. We are governed by institutions built by people who survived horrors we did not, and we are expected to live forever inside their fear. Understanding that doesn't mean embracing chaos. It means recognizing that trauma cannot be the foundation of permanent governance. History didn't end in 1945, and neither did human nature. There's a lot more that can be said on this topic, and I do plan on exploring it more. I think it's important for us to understand these issues because we need to know these topics to know what is happening to us and our Western countries if we will ever be able to solve any of this. If you don't know some of this stuff, it's easy for you to fall victim to these people's narratives, which are all-encompassing. Well, that's the end of that video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. And I'll see you next time on The Eclectic Journalist.